There, so today we have another beer talk, and this is about Kveik, the mysterious farmhouse yeast that has really changed craft beer and is one of the most important discoveries in craft beer in most recent time. So I'm gonna go through a little bit of history. What is Kveik? Where does it come from? What are the applications now? So let's start off. So we have to go all the way back to the 19th century in Norway, and just like in Belgium, they had farmhouse brewers. So you had a farmhouse and different families, and farmhouses would brew beer specifically for their farmhouse, and they would have their own yeast strain. So they would borrow yeast strains, just like the Belgian farmhouses would do, borrow yeast strains from each other. And they make a product that, probably is quite different from what we consider beer now, but this was a product that they enjoyed to have instead of water. Water was terrible back then. So fast forward through many generations, and this knowledge is passed down, but obviously it's a dying practice with the modernization of the world. Farmhouse and making traditional beer just becomes less and less popular. So we actually fast forward all the way to 2014, and we have one of the critical figures in the story, which is Lars Marius Gorshall, and he's a beer geek, and he wants us to learn more about beer. And I actually do remember being into craft beer and finding this blog, and I'm like, wow, this is like, you can go to the website, it's a blog. It's not like a fancy website and all this crazy stuff. This was some guy who's a beer geek and wants to travel around and find out more about beer and visit some farms and just write about his journey. This was just some guy with a blog, right? And he noticed something interesting. He's like, okay, these guys are brewing these beers, and oh wow, they're fermenting at 100 degrees, which is absolutely insane because generally most yeast strains that we're familiar with ferment beer at 70 degrees. And that's just a huge difference. And at 100 degrees, generally with the yeast that we're familiar with, and we're talking about American, British, Belgian, German yeast strains, you will spit off a lot of terrible flavors. And that's why obviously we don't ferment at those temperatures with most yeast strains. But they were making quite good product, or quite drinkable product, with these Kveik strains, these farmhouse strains. And so that was quite interesting. So along with fermenting at higher temperatures, you're also pushing through chemical processes at a much faster rate. So instead of turning over beer, fermenting beer for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, these beers are turning over within days. Like we're talking about, beer from start to finish within a week. And so that's absolutely crazy. And so he starts publishing his blog. I guess more and more interest becomes popular with it. And then finally, we actually now, in 2021, they started probably 3-4 years ago, yeast banks are now offering those Kveik yeasts to commercial and home brewers. So those are a little bit different in the sense that these are extracted strains because there's huge regionality to the Norwegian farmhouse culture. And, I don't think there's a way to exactly pinpoint how many yeast strains there are, but there's dozens to 50, I don't know, there's a lot of them, and each family had their own strain. But the other thing is that it's a lot of cross-pollination in the sense that like you had a strain, but then you'd use your neighbor's strain and that would cross-pollinate with yours, and then that would evolve. And we're talking about, evolution here with, genetics and yeast strains changing. And so the interesting thing about these Kveik yeast strains is that it does have some origin with the general ale strains that we're familiar with. They call beer one strains because there's, different kind of yeasts. There's beer yeast, there's wine yeast, there's different sake yeast and all this kind of other stuff. The beer one yeasts, which are the Saccharomyces strains that we're familiar with, and this is a ale yeast. Let's correct that. Kveik is ale, so it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is what we're familiar with. But these are versions of it, and so it is a version of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But at some point, it probably commingled with a wild yeast strain, so verged off very differently from what we're familiar with. So instead of fermenting again at temperatures of 60, 70 degrees, we're talking about able to ferment at 80, 90, 100, over 110 degrees, 100 degrees. So that's just absolutely insane. So where are we now with it? Kveik is now, I'd say, generally used with a lot of New England IPAs. So despite it not pushing off a lot of bad flavors, it can push off some of these really interesting tropical flavors and fruity flavors. So that works with New England IPA. And so that's one use of it. And then some breweries have just literally transitioned to use Kveik yeast. I think KCBC is one of those breweries in Bushwick. They use it because, it turns over beer a lot faster. And my opinion is that I think more breweries will start using it. They've had the opportunity to do it within the last few years, but a lot of brewers are stuck in their ways, and I think a lot of brewing is still in the old school mindset of like, this is how I was taught, and these are the yeast strains I'm familiar with. And a lot of being a brewer is being familiar with your yeast strains. But I think a lot of breweries might just start moving on to Kveik because of the fermentation speed. So if I had to make a lot of pasta at home, I'd be limited by the size of my pots, and I only have 4 burners. Like, I could buy a ton of pasta. I could make a lot of pasta in a bowl and mix it up with sauce, but I could only do so much because I have 4 burners. And that's sort of like brewing. You can make a lot of wort, you can package a lot of beer, you can do all kinds of stuff, but when it comes time to ferment that beer, it needs to sit in a tank. And that tank takes up space, costs a lot of money, is of a certain size, and it just sits there for a certain amount of time. And if you can shorten that from weeks to days, that is a huge difference. I mean, we're talking about making, instant 1-minute rice to sitting a rice in a rice cooker for 30 or 45 minutes. These are just vastly different things. For me, if I had to do any of this, I would try to use Kveik at least not only for turning over beer faster, but for the feedback loop, right? If I was only, part of being a brewer, in my opinion, is you constantly want to improve your product, and it's very process oriented, and you need a feedback loop, right? You're like, all right, this is what it turned out this time. Let me fix it. Let me do it different, and adjust it and tweak it, and adjust it and tweak it. And that's very much what a brewer's job is. I mean, obviously there's many other jobs, but that's part of the ethos of brewing. If you could do that just more frequently, as in 1/3 or 1/2 the amount of time, I think you're gonna make a better product, right? Whether Kveik can get you there is a different issue. So, people argue, Kveik is not viable for certain styles and how I want to brew, blah, blah, fine. But anyway, that's a little bit of my spin on it, along with some of the history about Kveik. Post in the comments below about what you know about Kveik and anything interesting about it. Until next time, hope you learned something.